Welcome one and all. I am Andrew Seco, and I am extremely lucky to be joined by Beatrice Van Slee, the author of Court of the Dead's Rise of the Reaper General, the first Court of the Dead novel. Bea, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Congratulations on the book release. This is huge. It is the...
Yeah, it is huge.
It is huge. It's a big book, and is a big and beautiful book filled with so many big and beautiful things. But before we even get into it, I have to know, as a personal fan, what's your faction?
Yes, Spirit faction, absolutely.
Spirit faction? Like through and through Spirit faction, me too.
Yeah, like I don't think that anyone can be 100% one faction, because the idea is to combine aspects and balance of all of the different factions.
So what is your personal experience with Court of the Dead before you even wrote this book?
I was brought on to develop the wisp words, which is the underworld slang. So I developed the weird words that exist only in the underworld, which that was a very fun process that involved examining the ways in which words become slang, the evolution of words that we use very often, or so often that they mutate into easier ways of presenting things, or maybe more polite or less polite, depending on the context,
My first introduction to the wisp word was in the Chronicle of the Underworld. That's what you did?
Yeah, I worked on the Chronicle for that.
Okay, so you're like at the ground floor of underworld linguistics, basically.
Yeah, the voice was, I think the tone of the underworld was well established. So enough to give me guidance and for creating these words, and coming up with a list of different words that would be associated with the different perspectives that are present in the underworld. For example, mourners describing the court, or the court describing the Celestials, and things that soldiers would say versus just regular street language. And those are words that made it through the Chronicle and that I used in Demothile. And over the course of writing Demothile, of course, I created quite a lot more.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's about a Reaper General, there's probably a lot of that soldier language in there, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the way soldiers probably talk to each other, anyone who's been a soldier or is familiar with soldier stories, the way that they interact isn't generally the same as they would in polite society.
I want to ask about the way that different characters speak, and I want to ask who your favorite character to write was, whether it was just dialogue or about that character.
Yeah, my favorite character to write would be the protagonist, Demothile, and I think I fashioned him to be fun to write at the outset, because it's sort of easy, I think, to get into the head of a character who is almost a blank slate and is trying to figure things out as he goes. So I can present to him all kinds of interesting, exotic, or scary, or traumatizing experiences, and there's a lot of room for him to spend time trying to understand what that is, and to put himself into an ever-evolving, I guess, pair of shoes.
Is there a character that is a little bit more challenging to write?
Definitely the Alltaker, Death. I styled his voice to be much more florid and I guess verbose. The idea being, this is an entity who he's literally a primordial force of the cosmos. So I wanted to kind of create in his voice something that felt old and wise, but also Tom from the beginning had always felt that Death's voice, it shouldn't just be too detached like a Gandalf wizard sense. It should be have a lot more color and personality, and I think that helped to evolve his voice, especially when talking about how he interacted with different groups. For example, he would speak sort of more florid and more lofty when talking to the Reapers, who he had like caused to become created, as opposed to his scions or his daughters, who he had specific interpersonal connections with each one of them that was different, because he was always kind of reacting to the things that they were doing in the various chapters. That's one way that I was able to manage the difficulty, I think, of approaching presenting Death's voice, was giving him different chapters and scenes where he would interact with different people in order to kind of create those layers. And then also he has his own chapter where you get to go and you get into his head and what's it like to be Death, you know? So that was extremely fun, yeah.
There's a chapter where you're first person in Death's head?
It's not first person, but it centers on Death, you know, from the third person point of view. But you get to see what you get to go inside Death's head.
There's one particular scene in the Mortis Veth where you have a unique time constraint.
Yeah.
A time loop for a fight.
Yeah.
I don't even know where to begin. Just tell me about it.
Well, so the premise for the overarching story is that the Reapers are created to protect the city of Ilverness from a scourge that's coming. That's really just going to wipe out the whole underworld. And they're already on the way when the Reapers are created. So I needed to create some time to get the Reapers up to fighting quality after just having been created. You know, these newborn warriors. I didn't want them to seem like robots that just come off the line and are ready to start shooting. You know, they needed to come together as there were 100 of them versus this big giant scourge of Bale Reavers. So each one had to become proficient in fighting like a warrior, not just like in a boot camp kind of sense, but more of like, how can I make them feel like they have really just been through it as if they were like veterans. They had like the wisdom and an uncanny skill that might be associated with a fighter who had been around for, you know, a lifetime. And so the way that I solved that issue was creating the time loop, which is a common sci-fi trope. It's most recognizable is the Groundhog Day, where you just get to repeat the same day like over and over again. In this case, it's being used specifically as a device to train the Reapers. So Tom had already created this training arena called Mortis Veth, in which the Reapers were pitted against all these different creatures. The idea being for them to learn how to fight together and with their own skills, to master their own individual skills. And so I took that a few steps further by showing that they would fight against absolutely impossible odds, but and the time would just reset once they were all completely annihilated. And that would happen pretty much instantaneously at first, because the odds were stacked so hard against them and they're just like little baby skeletons, like, I don't know what I'm gonna do, you know? And they just get completely crushed right away. But like what I tried to show is that over time they start to figure it out, and then over the course of figuring it out, they move deeper and deeper into like ever more complex strategic situations that they have to figure out how to solve, both together and separately, as they like move through a scenario that just keeps resetting. In this chapter, you're able to get a sense of how the Reapers evolve into a fighting force, but I also used it as a means by which I'm able to introduce characters that then become relevant throughout the rest of the story, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the time loop sort of allows
a lot of time for that, yeah.
A lot of time for progression and everything.
Yeah.
But it was interesting how you said that you didn't want them to get straight to their goal in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
And I sort of noticed you even sort of had your arm like linear. And I imagine that tracking tension through the novel as you get to this giant climax, it's extremely difficult because it's already a tense world to begin with. I feel like you're starting out up here and then just getting more tense and more tense. But there are moments in there, I'd say, where it just comes down a little bit. Like
sure.
Do you have a favorite funny moment or a moment of a little bit of reprieve before it gets more tense?
Yeah, I think when a story like this is presented as with such dire circumstances in a world that's very serious, and you know, there can be moments in there where you can explore elements that you can present to the very serious characters like Xyle and Demethyl that can end up being pretty funny, because they don't really know how to react to them. The nice thing about the underworld is that it's just this huge open playground where anything is possible. And so I spend a lot of time exploring things that are fascinating and mysterious and beautiful, but there are also a lot of opportunities for things that can be like ridiculous and totally silly, you know. And if you throw that at Xyle or Demethyle, and they're just like, you can kind of watch them struggle to react to it, and it can be kind of funny. So I think you were referring to a scene where Demethyle is in Gethsemane's. She's got kind of a brothel.
Yeah.
It's like one of her sanctuaries where people go for their various hedonistic pursuits. So Xyle has to go there to find Demethyle because he happens to be there for a non-hedonistic reason. But she is presented with something that is, I try to amp up the theme of Gethsemane's sort of flesh perspective, and it's something that Xyle, being a much more rigid and straightforward thinker, would find superfluous in the extreme and like ridiculous. And yeah, that moment has got some levity to it because she is forced to react to it. But I think if I had to pick my favorite, there's another scene in the book where Demethyle finds himself almost driven insane by this creature that just chatters at him, nonsensical stream of consciousness observations about Demethyle, and because I'm trying not to give too much away.
Yeah, don't spoil it.
Yeah. There's just, I mean, he meets all kinds of characters all throughout the book, and that's one of the nice things with this situation, that Demethyle's in. I have to kind of send him on a journey in order to develop as that character who can become the general, and in so doing, I have opportunities to invent characters that he can encounter, and those like they can be anything. And in this case, I made a character who's absurd in the extreme, I guess. And Demethyle's kind of like, he almost has to run away from it. So, yeah.
Well, that sounds like an extremely enjoyable journey to go through, and I'm really, really glad that we got to talk to you about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
If you guys want to go on the journey with Demethyle, go ahead and follow that link down below. If you want to learn more about the underworld and everything that Bee has so generously filled it with, all of that beautiful story and the fantastic Wisp word that you are totally going to want to learn, and there is a glossary in the back. If you guys want to know about that, go ahead and check that link down below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, rise, conquer, rule.